The timing screen flashed purple again. Another fastest sector, another Mercedes at the top. By the end of qualifying in Melbourne, the gap was almost a full second. An eternity in modern Formula One. In the cockpit of the Ferrari, Lewis Hamilton was already doing the math. Not the championship math, that would come later, but the kind every driver does when something on the timing sheet doesn't quite make sense. Because Mercedes weren't just faster. They were faster in a way that didn't match the usual patterns of drag, tire degradation, or energy deployment. Something deeper was happening inside the power unit. And within hours, the paddock started whispering about one phrase engineers rarely say out loud unless something unusual is happening. Compression ratio. If those whispers were true, the entire competitive balance of the 2026 season might already be shifting. The first race of a new Formula One era is supposed to reveal uncertainty. New regulations usually compress the field, blur the hierarchy, and leave engineers scrambling to understand where the real performance lies. But the 2026 season began differently. At the Australian Grand Prix in Melbourne, the Mercedes garage quickly realized something extraordinary was happening. On Saturday afternoon, the silver cars of George Russell and rookie sensation Andrea Kimi Antonelli climbed to the front row, not by a few hundredths, but by nearly a full second. In Formula One terms, that margin is enormous. A gap of 0.3 of a second per lap is usually enough to define a competitive advantage. Anything larger begins to raise eyebrows across the paddock. And this wasn't just a qualifying anomaly. Russell and Antonelli converted that speed into a dominant 1-2 finish on Sunday. Behind them, rival engineers began dissecting the lap data. Where was the speed coming from? The Mercedes cars weren't dramatically faster through high downforce corners. They weren't gaining unusual traction on exit. Instead, the advantage appeared most clearly on the straights. Each time the cars accelerated out of slower corners, the delta gap, the live timing difference, began shrinking for everyone behind. Then the whispers started. The source, some believed, was hidden deep inside the engine, not in the hybrid battery, not in the turbo, but in the internal combustion process itself, more specifically, the compression ratio. Within hours, the discussion had spread from engineering meetings to driver briefings. And when Hamilton stepped out of the Ferrari cockpit after qualifying, he gave the first public hint that something unusual might be happening. He didn't accuse Mercedes directly, but he didn't dismiss the theory either. "I hope it's not that compression ratio thing," he said quietly, because if it was, and if the numbers being discussed were accurate, the advantage might be worth 0.3 of a second per lap. Enough to decide races, enough to decide championships, and enough to force the governing body of Formula One to step in. To understand the controversy, you have to start with the rule itself. Under the 2026 Formula One engine regulations, the internal combustion engine must operate with a compression ratio of 16:1. In simple terms, that means the fuel-air mixture inside the cylinder is compressed 16 times before ignition. Higher compression generally produces more power, but also creates greater stress on engine components. The FIA introduced the 16:1 limit to keep engine outputs controlled and ensure closer competition. But the regulation included one detail that would soon become critical. The compression ratio measurement was defined while the engine was cold. And that distinction may have created an unexpected loophole. According to the theory circulating through the paddock, Mercedes engineers designed an engine that behaved differently once operating temperatures increased. While the ratio measured 16:1 during static inspection, thermal expansion inside the engine could alter internal geometry once the power unit reached race conditions. At operating temperature, the effective compression ratio may rise closer to 18:1. 2 additional points might sound minor, but in engine terms it represents a substantial increase in combustion efficiency. Some competitors, including drivers close to the situation, suggested that advantage might translate into roughly 30 additional horsepower. On a modern Formula One power unit producing around 1,000 horsepower when hybrid deployment is included, that increase is significant. More importantly, it could generate around 0.3 of a second per lap, which is exactly the gap engineers were seeing in the data. The numbers aligned too well to ignore. If Mercedes had indeed discovered a way to exploit the cold measurement rule, they had effectively found a legal performance window hidden inside the regulations. But legality in Formula One rarely settles the debate, because the sport has always operated within a delicate balance between innovation and interpretation. And when rivals begin losing time on the straights, interpretation suddenly becomes everyone's concern. That is when the political machinery of Formula One begins moving. Even if the compression ratio theory holds some truth, the story is more complicated than a single engine parameter. As analyst Bernie Collins pointed out after the race weekend, the evidence does not fully align with a simple engine advantage. If the power unit alone explained Mercedes' speed, every team using that engine would show similar performance. But that wasn't the case. Customer teams like McLaren, Williams, and Alpine were significantly slower, which suggests the advantage is not just the engine itself, it's the integration. In modern Formula One, the power unit does not exist in isolation. It works as part of a tightly interconnected system involving cooling architecture, energy recovery strategies, and aerodynamic balance. One team might extract additional power through combustion efficiency. Another might translate that power into lap time through lower drag. Mercedes, it appears, may have optimized both simultaneously. This is where the engineering philosophy comes into play. Every team approaches a new regulation cycle with a different design concept. Some prioritize aerodynamic efficiency, others chase mechanical grip, and some build their entire car around energy management. Mercedes may have done something different again, designing the car, cooling system, and hybrid deployment strategy specifically to exploit the unique behavior of their engine. That level of integration takes months, sometimes years, of simulation work. And it also explains why customer teams cannot simply copy the result. They may have the same hardware, but they do not have the same architecture around it. Which means the Mercedes Works team could be unlocking performance their own customers cannot reach. And for those customers, that realization creates a very uncomfortable position, because they are paying for the same engine, but racing with a different result. Inside the Ferrari garage, Hamilton's reaction revealed just how serious the situation might become. After qualifying in Melbourne, he spoke with unusual frankness. If they have that advantage for a few months, he said, the season could be done. The comment wasn't dramatic, it was mathematical. 7 races at 0.3 of a second per lap can quickly translate into a significant championship lead. If Mercedes dominated the opening phase of the season before any rule clarification arrived, the point swing could be enormous. Hamilton understood that reality better than most. Over the course of his career, he has seen how small technical advantages can reshape entire seasons. And he also knows how slowly the regulatory process sometimes moves. His response revealed another truth about Formula One. When one team finds a loophole, the others rarely wait quietly. Instead, they begin asking the same question. Should we copy it? Hamilton even suggested Ferrari might pursue that path if the FIA allowed the concept to continue, which created an unusual scenario. Drivers rarely encourage their own teams to replicate controversial engineering ideas. But Hamilton's message was clear. If the interpretation remains legal, every competitor will eventually try to exploit it, and once that happens, the advantage disappears. But the political conflict begins. As complaints from rival teams grew louder, the FIA began reviewing the situation. The governing body of Formula One rarely moves quickly when technical interpretations emerge, but this case raised broader concerns about competitive fairness. If the compression ratio rule could be manipulated through temperature-dependent behavior, the regulation itself might require clarification. The FIA's response was direct. Beginning with the Monaco Grand Prix, engines would no longer be tested solely in cold conditions. Instead, inspections would include measurements while the power unit was hot. That adjustment effectively closed the suspected loophole, and it introduced a new strategic dimension to the season. Mercedes would have a limited window, roughly the first 7 races, before the new testing protocol came into effect, which means the early championship battles might unfold under one technical framework, while the rest of the season would operate under another. In Formula One, such mid-season changes are rare but not unprecedented. They create a strange competitive environment where one team must maximize an advantage before it disappears. Meanwhile, rivals must survive long enough for the balance to shift. And when the Monaco deadline was announced, everyone in the paddock began calculating how many points Mercedes might collect before the rule interpretation changed. Because if the early races went their way, the title fight could already be tilted by summer. But the political chess match didn't end with the compression ratio debate. Another rule suddenly became important: the Additional Development Opportunities Regulation, often shortened to ADU. This rule exists to prevent engine manufacturers from falling too far behind. If a power unit is between 2 and 4% slower than the fastest engine, the manufacturer is allowed one upgrade during the season. If the deficit exceeds 4%, they receive 2. On paper, the system encourages competitive balance. But it also creates a fascinating strategic possibility. If Mercedes' engine proves dramatically faster, rivals like Ferrari and Red Bull could qualify for extra development opportunities, which would allow them to introduce performance upgrades mid-season. That possibility has not gone unnoticed inside the Mercedes camp. Some analysts believe the team may attempt to manage its performance carefully, winning races but avoiding the kind of dominance that would trigger additional development allowances for competitors. In other words, the fastest team might intentionally limit how fast it appears. That kind of strategic restraint sounds unusual, but Formula One has always been a sport where the rulebook matters almost as much as the stopwatch. And sometimes controlling the championship means controlling what your rivals are allowed to build next. From a championship perspective, the stakes are enormous. A 3/10 advantage across the opening 7 races could easily translate into multiple victories. Each win brings 25 points. Add fastest laps and consistent podiums, and the championship gap can grow quickly. Even a lead of 40 or 50 points early in the season can shape the psychological momentum of a title fight. Drivers begin pushing harder. Teams begin taking greater strategic risks. And sometimes those risks lead to mistakes. That is why Hamilton's concern after Melbourne carried so much weight. He wasn't just talking about one race. He was talking about the cumulative effect of 7 races where one team may have a technical edge that rivals cannot match. If Mercedes uses that window effectively, the championship narrative might already be defined before the European races begin. But if the field stays close enough, the FIA's rule clarification in Monaco could reset the competitive order, and suddenly, the entire title fight would open again, which is why every team in the paddock is watching the early races so carefully. Because those opening weekends might determine whether the championship becomes a runaway story or a season-long battle.